Hello guys. I see most of the necessary folks here. I am expecting Quinton also to join. We'll probably wait for 2 more minutes, and if he doesn't join, we can start. Yeah, I think we should start the meeting. There were a couple of expectations when we finished Monday's meeting. 2 pointers. One was like a generic pointer that we basically need to converge on that building blocks API. That's what is needed or expected from today's meeting. The other point I remember while we were finishing the last meeting, I think Paul, you suggested that maybe Maru or somebody would prepare the differences what Maru's prototype has with respect to the documentation that Quinton has done.
Yeah, I think that we should spend some time discussing like the vocabulary mismatches and get those sorted out. I think we've started looking at those, but we didn't reconcile them yet. So maybe that would be a good way to start out today, if we can just work through the vocabulary. So do folks... Yep. You folks want to just go ahead and get that started now?
Yeah, I think we can start with that.
I think this is kind of hard to accomplish without Quinton in attendance, because he's the person who is kind of on the other side of the fence with regards to vocab. So
yeah, I sort of agree.
Okay. Well, I don't want to block. Do we have other things to talk about?
Irfan, did you get a chance to enumerate the concerns?
Yes. So that was the other expectation. So I did update them in the agenda notes for this meeting. I'll just share the link and I'll share the document also. So there are items which have been discussed one and multiple times before. I think we can choose to ignore discussing some of these, or if it is fruitful, we can maybe talk about them again. My intention is that these are sort of open, and if we are see the whole reason we are actually doing V2, or we moved to this space where we are trying to figure out a multi-cluster API which might be a fit or suitable stuff for multiple implementations, was because of some inherent issues we saw with V1, which were sort of difficult to solve or were not solvable at that point of time. The same sort of applies to current implementation also. One of the major problems we saw in V1 was annotations, and a simple solution to that problem was details or fields as part of the federated spec. So that was the starting step for us, but we have come much longer than that. I think there are 5 that I listed. One still remains is version skew. The other one is which API or which version of the K8s API Federation should use. There has been discussions around this, that if there is a generic way it can understand, for example, a K8s cluster supports 3 different versions for apps API, then Federation should also be able to understand all those 3 different versions of apps API. But there is no concrete solution for that yet. Yeah, correct. I mean, there is.
I thought that we discussed this in the context of the brainstorming doc, and I mean, because of the way that the like the controller or controllers are built, I think it's basically we'll use the latest version that we know about. So if Federation has V1 for, say, secrets at the time that it's built and released, that's how it's going to talk to the underlying clusters. If it has only V1 Alpha 1, that's how it's going to talk to the clusters. And when you upgrade, you have the possibility of changing the version that's supported. But to me, this is kind of like it's not really something that we have a lot of wiggle room over because of the way that typing works and the way the client libraries work. We can only use what we know about. And rather than supporting multiple versions, we just use the max version we know about. Like I don't see any value in supporting previous versions. If we know about V1, there's no point in talking to the server as in a V1 Alpha 1 mode or Beta 1 or whatever, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I sort of agree to what you are saying. Actually, our previous discussions also sort of concluded this. That's what I have written in the notes section of it. But there are some gotchas for this also. It is with respect to that version skew, because the users are free to federate different versions of clusters.
No, that's not true. That's not true. We can't allow them to use any version. It can only be forward versions, and the reasons for that have been discussed in depth previously. So you're correct that they could potentially have like a 1.9 Federation and a 1.10, 1.11, 1.12. How many over forward versions we're supporting Kubernetes? And as you say, there is a potential for like maybe it's V1, Beta 1 at, one cluster, and it's V1 in another cluster. But essentially, Federation is still gated by the maximum version it knew about when it released. So if V1 Beta 1 is what it's talking to all the clusters at, the fact that one of the clusters might support a newer version is something that we essentially, like, we're just going to have to talk with V1 Beta 1. And we have to rely on Kubernetes backwards compatibility guarantees. I mean, they don't always work, but we can test it at least to handle the case where there is a disjoint between the maximum supported version and the version Federation supports. But as far as which version like Federation will allow for, we can't allow V1 if any of the clusters are on V1 Beta 1. It's basically just, it opens the door to too many complications.
Yeah,
I'm in agreement here. So in order for this technology to be useful for people and usable without a lot of unexpected surprises, I think we need to be really very, very clear about what the constraints are in terms of if you choose to use Federation to distribute, if you choose to use federated API, that you need to ensure that you keep your clusters in sync with the the federation, in the sense that like to just drive something home, possibly unnecessary. If you try to federate an API and you use or you say that you use a federation that knows about that knows about 110, for example, and you try to use that against a cluster that's on 1.3, like you should not have an expectation that that is going to work. And by the same token, I think that like we should be very careful about qualifying when you use a cluster that is ahead of what your federation knows about, that you're getting into territory where things may not work as you expect. So for example, Kubernetes APIs are supposed to be backward compatible, but it's not uncommon at all to add validations that were missed in an old version, for example. I've done this several times, and when you add a validation, you basically make resources that would fail the validation now invalid. And so in the interest of keeping like unexpected validation errors to a minimum, I think that we've got to be just absolutely crystal clear about what version federation targets. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does make sense to me right now. And I think there are some concluding pointers to both these problems, which is like the version skew and what version of API the federation controller should use. But we have come across some use cases where our customers have asked a possibility of a solution where federation is sort of used as a layer, a front-facing or the user-facing layer against multiple clusters, which might be in different hybrid clouds. So the requirement that the clusters might be of different types or different versions actually comes from there. It's completely okay that this is not necessarily solved in scope of federation, and we can choose to do as listed over here right now.
I mean, there's no deterministic way to solve that if they want to use versions prior to federation. If they want to use forward versions and have skew across their clusters, there's a potential for problems, but it should probably be okay most of the time. So as long as we're clear on that, forward version okay, backwards version not okay. And then users, if they want to have if they want to have different versions between, they have member clusters of different versions, they just have to understand there's a certain amount of risk involved. It certainly would be something that, we're supporting this in the sense that we're going to try to propagate to these things and you have a reasonable degree of success. Does that make sense?
It does.
I'm hoping the use case isn't that you want to support users who are actually having versions before federation.
No, so there are other ways of doing that also, like consolidating access to multiple clusters can actually be built in user-facing layer separately in a different way, a totally proprietary
way. But the challenge isn't so much like that it's possible, it's more like that the behavior is undefined. If we're talking to a cluster, I think that like I'm trying to recall the cases, because Garrett Carr was the person who brought this up in the meeting in August, or maybe July. But the concern was that if, like, backwards compatibility works to a point, but if you're at a given version of federation, you're talking to a previous version of Kubernetes, you may have new fields that define new behaviors, and the users are setting those fields. And if those resources are applied to older version of Kubernetes, the expected behavior won't necessarily occur because those fields don't exist, and therefore it's undefined what would happen if you didn't provide that configuration. Maybe that it's as expected, but there's zero guarantees that it is. So whereas with forward compatible, like, because you're you're really talking about forward compatibility, like how can Kubernetes be compatible with, sorry, I'm just confusing things by using forward again.
No, it's fine, it's fine. It's sort of understood. What we are saying is that a particular version of Federation, which sort of is built using or on top of resources from a particular KTS version, that Federation version can be used with, say, the next release or the next to next release of Kubernetes.
Right.
But it's like quite a rare case if you think it logically. So what will happen if we continue to do active development on Federation is we'll sort of follow a particular release of Kubernetes. So for example, 1.10 is cut out. Federation would know, okay, so probably the latest API available for apps in 1.10 is apps v1. Let's use this particular version for apps related resources.
But I mean, I think that's sort of a different case. I'm talking about like Kubernetes, like, because you can add fields to v1, right? As long
I think
as
you're talking about in terms of the API versions, right?
No, sorry. I was talking about the Kubernetes version. Like think about like, I have apps v1 and I have, a replica set or something. And in Kubernetes 1.11, it'll appear in one way, and in 1.12, they'll add a field. And the addition of that field will change behavior. And there'll be an intelligent default, but effectively, if you don't provide that field, you're getting that default behavior, which may or may not be what you want. But at least the default's provided. But if you go backwards, the field didn't exist, then
yeah.
I'm having trouble explaining this. I apologize. Yeah. I'll stop trying that.
I think the explanation is pretty clear. It might be worth though, since I wouldn't say that like these things that we're discussing are obvious, right? And like they're not super obvious even to us in this call as subject matter experts. So it probably is worth decomposing what the different types of skew are and articulating this in the proposal for V2 as far as like explaining to people why certain things won't be supported and why certain things may be possible but not recommended at all, so that there is something more substantial than a recording of this conversation that people can find out about these things and learn to reason about them.
Actually, there are older conversations, and this, as Maru, I think, is well aware that this has been discussed time and again. And the only thing I am trying to reach it is at a conclusive mechanism to address this. Or we say that only one way of addressing this is that we keep forward compatibility only, and that's how the reference in open source will go.
Yeah, I think that forward compatibility only is, no pun intended, the only thing that we could do and be successful.
Yeah.
So maybe
there is a link. Go ahead, Maru.
Sorry, I was just going to say, what I would hope is we could put the conclusion down, because I think at least some of these issues, I think we've decided on it, but I do agree with Paul that there maybe is insufficient documentation as to why those decisions were reached. And that way, we can have clarity as to how things are going to be, and then we can make sure that we backfill and we bring people up to speed as to why that is the case.
I tell you what, why don't I take a stab in the document of articulating this now. I cannot share my screen at this moment, but I'm in that doc, and I will drop a link to it in the chat.
Paul, I was actually thinking of whatever I have put here as the open problems. they can be added as a FAQ kind of a thing for example, a question or a problem, and then possible suggestions or solutions for that in whatever conclusive doc we use for the API, so that the information remains at one place. You can go ahead and do that.
Sorry, my hesitation is because periodically Zoom completely freezes the rendering of my desktop. I wasn't sure whether I was muted or not. Let's do this. I'm going to take a moment and summarize the two big rocks here around forward and backward compatibility. We don't have to devote meeting time to this, but I will do it quickly as a suggestion, and then I'll put a link to the chat in a few moments once I write it down.
Sure.
So my suggestion is, like I said, the inclusion on version skew is forward versions of Kubernetes. Like Kubernetes version has to be greater than or equal to Federation version. And then as far as the version which Federation should credit a particular resource to, the maximum version it knows about. Since we're only doing forward versioning of the release, we're guaranteed that every cluster, every member cluster will support at a minimum the maximum version that the Kubernetes, that Federation knows about when it was built, when it was released. So these are really tied. If you don't solve one of these, you can't really make a decision about the other. But if you say forward compatibility, then you're kind of forced into deciding that you support the maximum version only. Like you can't support versions you don't know about, and why would you support older versions? And
Yeah.
I guess part of this is that, I mean, in a previous world where Kubernetes and the Federation APIs were, the lines between them were blurred, it would be it would be possible to create a replica set at a different, like at multiple versions. You could create it in V1, or you could create it in V1 beta 1, and then you'd be like, well, what version do I federate? Well, in the case of federated resources, it's going to be a little bit more explicit because we're going to support whichever version we know about. We're not going to tie the version of the federated resource to the actual version we're going to propagate. It can vary over time. If I create a federated resource, and at the time that I create it, I only know about V1 beta 1, and then a future release, you upgrade to one that supports V1 of that, replica set resource, we're going to federate it V1 from then on. We're not going to worry about, federating at V1 beta 1. Does that make sense?
Yep. That makes sense. That makes sense. So Paul, as he suggested, he's going to articulate this discussion somewhere. He suggested. Okay. The next, which is again discussed earlier, is the authentication authorization. Probably we need to put the concluding or the mechanism that we are going to use for V2 somewhere. And I don't think we need much discussion on this around. Like last discussion, I remember that we sort of concluded that current release or the initial releases of Federation V2 might just suggest that it is required to have an admin access to the federated clusters.
I think that's true in the case of push reconciliation, and where people want different behavior, we would point them at the possibility of pull reconciliation, because then they'd be able to define, I mean, a pull reconciler could be as comprehensive as they want. It could have full admin rights, but it could also have limited rights to select namespaces in that particular cluster. And it's kind of kicking down the can down the road, but I think that's kind of what we need to make progress. If we try to solve the granular use case as previously discussed, there's scalability concerns, and it adds a lot of complexity.
Uh, the defaulting and validation, I just tried to list them, and as I mentioned, my intention was to probably create a FAQ kind of a list at the end of that API documentation, which can be authoritative location for these problems. So defaulting and validations also is there, which I think Maru has suggested some solution currently which can be used. I saw that in the added documentation you have listed that around that API documentation.
Are you here on Monday? The meeting on Monday?
I was there, yes.
Because I think like some of the discussion around that, Shashi brought up the point that the default, I mean, I'd just been worried about the defaulting because that was breaking me, but the validation is something entirely different. And I think Paul brought up the issue of quota. So there's all kinds of ways that you can define resources in Federation API that will not propagate successfully due to defaulting or validation or quota or any number of other things. So I think in the near term, we're just going to avoid addressing those issues. Like, I think the version accounting scheme that I proposed and have implemented, I think that makes sense in the near term, just to make sure that we can avoid like endless reconciliation. But in terms of actually catching errors caused by any of these things, I think we're probably going to have to develop like strategies that are more in the form of monitoring and documentation, like educating users as to how to detect problems that occur in a distributed system. Because we just, you know, in the same way that if you can create a pod with an image that is not pullable, and that it won't validate the image name, but then once you actually try to run the pod, you know, the kubelet will go, oh, this doesn't seem to work. Docker will complain, whatever. And the user needs to understand the implications that, like, just because I submit something to the API, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct and my workload will run. And they have to be able to detect when problems occur. So I think we kind of face the same challenge with Federation in educating users. So.
So I'm typing in suggested changes to give treatment to the SKU issues. And one thing that comes to mind is I'm wondering to myself whether whether we should consider a software solution or like a technological solution to the problem of ensuring that Federation is not used to target clusters that are not at the minimum required version. So for example, if I have a Federation that knows about 110 and I point it at a cluster that is a 1.5 cluster, I feel like Federation should say, hey, it's not going to work right, don't do it.
I think, I mean, the way that at least the push reconciler that Finord has works, I mean, it's based on how V1 works, where there's a cluster controller that does health checks. And this could be something, this could be a health check. And it could even be something that, you know, we could configurably disable that health check. So if people really wanted to do that, they could. But by default, we would just say, sorry, this cluster is not available because, you know, it is not of the correct version. We only want versions greater than this.
Actually, we discussed, like I and Shashi discussed around this, and we use like join mechanism, right? So this check could be around join also when the cluster is getting added.
Right, but join is at the time of creation, and that doesn't account for the fact that upgrades will occur. So I'm not saying you could do the join as well, but it wouldn't be sufficient to guarantee use of an older cluster.
Agree. Yeah, so most of this is around supporting a version that can work, like which has much lesser chances of failing compared to supporting a version which might just break.
I mean, the main thing is just if a user comes to, you know, ask for support in the channel or in the group or whatever, and they report having a problem, one of the first things we're probably going to need to ask is like, what are the versions of the clusters you're federating to? Are there any versions older than the federation? And by having a version check explicitly in there, unless they disable it, like we don't really have to ask that question at that point because we've already validated it in the code. And we just ask, have you disabled the version check? And if they haven't, then we don't have to, ask them about the versions of the clusters they're using.
So you have already implemented this in this node, right? The version check?
Version check? No. I'm just kind of assuming you're not going to add an older version.
Oh, that's the solution you listed. Okay. Yeah, that's the solution you listed. That's not. Okay.
Oh, you're talking about the defaulting. So that's, sorry, that's sort of a different thing. Yes. So that's more about version accounting. So that when I'm propagating a resource, I'm recording the resource versions that were used to generate that resource and the resulting resource version after successful propagation, add or update. So yes, that is implemented.
Okay.
And this is, a lot of this is in the context of push reconciliation. In the case of pull reconciliation, it would obviously be different. It's kind of a TBD because at least I don't have any experience working with something kubeapplier-like. I'm sure there's similar gotchas on their end that we haven't even considered yet. Oh, Paul is frozen because Zoom just died for him. He'll be back in a sec, hopefully.
Okay. Did Quinton join? I didn't. Not sure.
I don't think so, no.
Okay, he didn't mention that he won't be. My last indication was that he would be on Wednesday.
Paul is back.
I'm back and better than ever.
Okay, the last point.
In here.
So did you update something, Paul?
No, I'm making a very stupid joke.
Okay.
So I think we kind of diverged from defaulting and validations. There's two sort of, I think item 2 on point D really belongs in the version skew section, point A.
Yeah, I'm struggling to articulate the solution or the conclusion for this defaulting and validation. Would you please help me on that?
So,
you.
Right. So, so the problem is that you can't do direct comparison. I think there's two problems. Defaulting is one thing and validation is another. Validation, so I would separate those out, have a separate item for validation. Defaulting, the problem is that it's not possible to compare a resource created in the Federation API with a resource created in a Kubernetes API if the Kubernetes API applies defaults and the resource didn't supply values for those defaults. Because say if I have a pod resource in Federation API that does not specify image pull policy, and then the Kubernetes API will apply always pull as the default. And so when I try to compare those resources, a naive comparison would say, hey, they're not the same. And then the Federation controller would go, oh, let me update that. And it would, it would make a call. And the next reconciliation loop would be like, oh, still not the same. And it would just endlessly try to update it. So rather than include all the defaulting or try to include all the defaulting, the suggested approach is to track the versions of the resources involved. So version of template, version of overrides, match it to the version of the resource that we add or updated. And then the next reconciliation loop will go, oh, the resource versions haven't changed, therefore I don't need to perform any action. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but how exactly the case, for example, a user or application changes some field in the resource which is created in the cluster. It should ideally be reconciled in this case, right?
Right. So if that occurs, the resource version of that resource will change, and the recorded resource version in the controller will be different. And so the controller will know, oh, I have to add or update. It is different. Like essentially, we're substituting a version check for, sorry, an equality check for a version check. Rather than saying, are these different? I'm just saying, are the versions that I know about different? And if they are, then I have to, even if they're actually the same, I have to reconcile. And that's the cost. Like I could potentially do unnecessary like calls or like updates or adds. No, just updates. This is strictly an update thing.
But in this case also, so are you saying that the federated controller will create the resource, then after creation it will get the resource back and then record that as the actual resource and replace that as the template?
It'll record the resource version.
And what about the rest of the stack? So, so let me give an example. So, for example, replica set is created in Federation, a federated replica set. So it has a template. It omits everything except few fields. For example, total replicas or something like that. Okay. This is created by the controller into say cluster 1, and cluster 1 applies defaults and all. Okay, so, and then it will. Yeah, I think you understood.
Oh, so, keep going.
So it will return, So it will return the created object back, saying that this is what I have created, where the defaults would be filled. So default fields would be filled. So this is the resource that we'll keep in federated spec or update in federated spec.
No. So the only thing we track are the versions. So essentially, like the scheme like the resource version is something that is incremented or changed every single time you make a change to the object. So when if I take you through, like I have a replica set template and potentially a replica set override resource. And then I generate like the representation I want to appear in a given cluster. I add it to that cluster. I get the resource back as part of the add or the create call. And then I record its resource version along with the resource version of the template and the override that were used to generate it. Now, if any one of these change, if the template changes, if the override changes, or if the resource in the cluster changes, even if it's an innocuous change and effectively a no-op, like if their form doesn't change, the controller will detect that change because the next time it sees it, it'll go, oh, the version of the resource is different from the one that I recorded from the last successful add or update. So I need to perform an update. Like it's in the same way that there used to be like an equivalency check. Are these resources equal? Now what I'm doing is saying, are the versions of the resources involved different from what I recorded? And if they are, then an update is implied.
So yeah, it does. So how I understand it is, so for example, a version is updated in the cluster. So the check that you will do for equality or difference of fields would be, you would be comparing each of the fields in the overrides in your template resource and
not each of the fields, only the resource version that was recorded on the last successful update.
No, if the version is different, then how do you figure out that what is updated? For example, some field is updated which is neither specified in the template resource or the overrides or the third one, whatever you are calling it.
But it doesn't matter what the fields are. Whenever any field changes, Kubernetes, like comes from etcd, it's like a sequence number, but the resource is updated. So if I change any field, even one that doesn't appear in the template or the override in the cluster, the resource version of that like resource is changed, and that will be detected by the controller. So we're really relying.
I understood that. I understood that. This is detected by the controller. I'm talking about the next step. Like controller detects something has changed. Now, how does it determine that what should I write? So it will update whatever the replica set it created using the override and the template again as the original?
Yeah. Correct. It's exactly the same mechanism for determining the form that should appear in that cluster as is always used.
Okay.
Sorry,
I'm
not sure I understood.
Makes sense.
Okay.
So this seems like a reasonable solution to defaulting to me. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a bad solution. It seems like a reasonable solution to me. About validation, you said validation is a different problem.
And we're going to, so on that topic, I think it's just a matter of like user education and maybe exploring how validation can go wrong and identifying like, more logging, or because really it's a matter of the user needs to be able to detect these problems that occur out of band and respond to them. And we probably need some help in the form of documentation or walkthroughs or whatever, so that when these problems occur, like the user has some way of learning about how to cope with those sorts of circumstances where validation, quota issues, out of band things prevent propagation. How do you detect that? And, some of it should be solved by, detecting the problem. If say, a replica set didn't get deployed, I think that a reasonable expectation is that for any given application, there's enough monitoring so you go, oh, my application isn't actually running in that cluster. And then the secondary, response would be, why is that? Let's go look at the propagation logs. Oh, look, I couldn't propagate because, I was out of quota. So to me, it's not something that we're going to solve like with some sort of automated solution. It's going to be more making sure people understand their responsibility in diagnosing these problems and making sure that we provide them enough detail to do so.
Yeah, I also think it's important for propagation to do the right things, which when I say right things, I mean, I don't think propagation can like solve these issues for you, but one of the things that, if I remember correctly, is on like the design document is that propagation should have status, so that there is a place that you can look at for a particular propagation scheme where you can learn about like when I have not been able to, for example, I haven't been able to put replica set X into cluster Y, this is the error associated with it.
And I believe we already have that. Like if any sort of error with a reconciler, events are generated associated with that resource. So if someone was to do, get that resource and take a look at it, just like when you have a pod and it's in a restart loop or something, you see a bunch of events, we would have something very similar for a federated resource.
Yeah, so I want to tease out there are two different, like very hard to tell apart, but fundamentally different facets here, at least to me. One of them is, as the propagation mechanism, I tried to put something into a cluster and I couldn't. Like I was prevented from doing so by, for example, the emission controller enforcing my quota in that cluster, or the quota for the service account that I'm using. So the API server wouldn't even accept the resource. I couldn't put it there.
But wouldn't it tell you, if you're talking about propagation, the reconciler would make a REST call to try to create a resource, would get a quota error, and could record that quota error as an event on the federated resource. Is there something missing from that?
I think that's generally correct. I'm not I'm not certain in my own mind where, like, what the event should be created on. Does that make sense?
So just because I guess I kind of see, I'm thinking of, oh, I have a federated resource, but then if I have 100 clusters, I don't really want 100 clusters worth of events. That just seems like indecipherable and useless.
Yeah.
Huh. So that is the problem. I was kind of what I was talking about was basically the scheme that the existing like Federation V1 uses. And it seems like that is maybe not a scalable solution. And I'm curious what you would propose as an alternative.
Yeah, like I said, I'm more sharing the questions that are in my mind than any answers, since I don't have any answers for this yet. But it's something that we should think about. And I think you're right that like it may be that the right thing to do at 10 clusters is not the right thing at all to do for 1,000 clusters. Right?
But that said, I mean, the UX of having it on a given resource is probably terrible. But I mean, events, I'm assuming this isn't a problem unique to us, and that there's a way to slice and dice events in the same way that you would say, grep through or filter like a syslog or any other form of logging. So my perception of how you would use it maybe didn't line up, but I'm not sure the mechanism for recording the problem would be different. It would just be how would you interact with the event stream?
Yeah, so here's another thing that just came to mind. We could have a resource that actually represents an error that is not an event. Like one thing about events is they have a TTL. So like they only live for so long in the API server before they're just garbage collected.
And why is that a problem? I mean,
it's not a problem.
Repeatedly.
It's here's what's in my head. Say that we do have 1,000 clusters, and I think it's probably arguable, although I don't have any experience to back this up, that if you had 1,000 clusters, you're probably less interested in knowing about success for everything than you are failure. I wonder if there's a way that we can like call out things that need user attention that shouldn't have a TTL like events do.
I guess I'm not clear. I'm not clear of the value of that.
Okay.
Just because if someone genuinely cares about the persistence of events, they could do that.
I mean, they get you can just turn on audit and like collect events into your audit mechanism.
Right, and I guess like I'm assuming the TTL is a concern because if I have an error and then I miss it, or it disappears. But I would say that the way that at least a push reconciler works, if there's some sort of quota error, that error will appear every 5 seconds, every minute. Like we'll probably have a back off, but that will recur. So it's not like, oh, it's a TTL and I'll lose that error. I will probably have too many instances of that error when it pops up. And it's only if it was to be automatically resolved that I would lose that detail. But do I care? Like only for forensic purposes, things are fixed at that point.
I guess like at a qualitative level, I'm thinking to myself that this isn't something that we'll probably solve in this call. I think we'll likely need to pay attention to this as we move forward. And I guess it's worth actually constructing scenarios. So, for example, we could artificially construct a scenario where you had an exhausted quota for secrets, and you tried to point Nord at a cluster where your secret quota was exhausted, and seeing what happened. and asking ourselves, what would we want to know as users in this case? It might be a productive exercise.
I mean, I think I have a pretty good idea of that, just because, like I said, Federation v1 isn't too different. And if there was some sort of problem in propagating to a given cluster, the reconciler would be recording errors on every reconcile pass on that resource. But I really don't think that's how you would detect things. Like, I don't think, oh yeah, you want to go look at the Federation logs as your first line of defense. It would be, I have an application that is depending on that secret that is now blinking red on my monitoring dashboard. And then I will go, huh, why is that the case? And then maybe, you know, one of the secondary steps I would take would be go look at the errors for that application's resources. So maybe, I mean, I think there's kind of two levels to this. One is, am I generating enough detail as events or resources or whatever so that someone could diagnose the problem, and then having sort of layers above that that are like, I want to see, you know, what are the errors for everything in this namespace? I think that's something you can do with events by default. But then maybe, you know, another use case is, I want to see all the errors for the application defined by this selector. Like, whether that's something that's easy to do or not, but like, I can imagine wanting that sort of user experience where it's like, I have an application, there's some error, I want to at least double check that it's not due to Federation failing to propagate for whatever reason. Dario, do you have any thoughts on that? Sorry to put you on the spot. I'm just curious because I think you have more sort of insight into actually using this than maybe I do.
Sorry, I'm just okay. Actually, we have fundamentally both test cases, where we have a small number of clusters and a big number of clusters in the same federation. At least this is the idea. I cannot enter in details for obvious reasons, but probably if I understood correctly the questions, we were very happy with what has been proposed by Paul some time ago, where the statuses of the clusters can be something configurable or something that can be dynamically changed according to the implementation. So if I want to drill down to some kinds of, to have more knowledge for one particular clusters, I will implement something that will expose that information. Otherwise, for us, it's going to be okay to say, okay, I have a very high level vision of the status of each cluster application and the various components. So I don't have a direct answer if I understood correctly the question. Day one, I would say that having a very high level vision is going to be okay, and every operator should be logged to the cluster to have a more detailed vision. Don't know if this is answer to the question, Mauro.
I think maybe I was calling on you just because I think I would appreciate your insight, and maybe I'm just trying to galvanize your thought process around what you would like to see. I mean, I kind of given you run applications already. I mean, if you're running Kubernetes, you're running applications, and presumably you have monitoring solutions to, you know, evaluate the health of your cluster and individual applications in that cluster. I'm curious just how granular you'd like to be able to look at Federation errors to support like detecting problems with propagation. And like I said, I don't really need an answer or expect one, but more like maybe you can think about it and get back to us. That make sense?
Yeah, sure, it makes sense. But in our vision, with something that we already spoke internally, it's not that different that what you said previously before. I'm sorry. So when you have a pod that doesn't work correctly, what you do, what we normally do is that we log on each single node, and we have a look to the journal and start to understanding what is happening. In our vision, the federation should work similarly. So when you have an application that does not work correctly, you have to go to the cluster and try to understand what is happening. What we have today monitoring is a little bit strange because we have various solutions implemented already. Some of them are legacy solutions, so we built on. And some are OpenShift native solutions. But I'm not 100% sure that those solutions are the norm, what we use today in production. So I can collect more information and eventually share it if you want to.
Okay.
If also for the audience.
I think
I can take the action for the next meeting on Monday.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
And I think to reframe a little bit, because as I've been listening to you, I've been realizing the fundamental problem is how do you detect when a resource is missing from a cluster? Like it was intended to be propagated, it wasn't propagated for whatever reason. Like your application might fail because the secret is missing or a pod wasn't deployed or whatever. And the root cause is something is missing. How do you detect that? Like you probably can't detect that at the cluster level unless you know exactly what is making up that application. And so it would only be like, this application isn't running, it would be like, are there any errors related to propagation for the resources of that application? Which to me implies like knowing, like having a sense in the federation side, like having an application grouping, I guess. I don't know if that's useful or if there's other ways to do it, but if I just focus on that one problem though, how do I detect that a resource is missing from a cluster where it should exist? That's kind of the problem that I'm curious if there's, what you think a good solution for that would be. Does that make more sense? Because I'm hoping it's a more constrained question.
No, it does. But today we have a monitoring system that is built on labels fundamentally. That's one of the reasons we work it. We spend some time on labels. But I have to admit that for the cluster names we have some bugs. For example, we have still some work to do. So fundamentally, that's the idea. We have a grouping mechanism that is based on labels, and those labels are exposed via downward API, I think, if I remember correctly. And
you are correct in volumes.
Yeah, right.
So, Daniel, do you use events at all ever? Because I was thinking that events actually is one good mechanism for the user to understand what's actually happening with what they desired for.
No. We don't use events because events are good stuff to troubleshoot eventually, but are very bad to try to automatize stuff, and events are very, very short life in the clusters.
Yeah, they can be lost. Yeah.
So we don't do that.
Okay.
Or at least we shouldn't do that. Then now we have several clusters, and I cannot grant 100% that no one is using, but at least we are trying to avoid to do them. And more than that, we are trying to avoid to take some decision according to events and to automatize stuff on top of events because it's are not good are good enough.
So -1 for events then? We should be considering alternatives?
Yeah.
No, yeah. And even there is no, I don't know exactly what's the status of the very, very recent of Kubernetes, but I know that, for example, for the events, there were no stable framework saying, be sure, okay, this is happening, so the event has been generated in this precise moment. So the situation where the event was a little bit chaotic, and there were some controllers that were generated a lot of events, some other controllers that generated less events, and you cannot take decision according to where the situation is not so uniform. So not sure if I managed to communicate, but
I mean, it's weird because events, I guess, the term event kind of implies something that it's somehow an indication of state that, you know, is consistent.
Mm.
And I really think an event stream in Kubernetes is really just a bunch of like, it's just logging. So
yeah, but it's like event generation is a little bit arbitrary. At least it was.
Yeah. In the same way that logging is arbitrary.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same problem.
Yeah.
And because there's no framework to do some stuff, probably the situation is improving. At least the controllers start to be very, very similar now. But in older version, and we have some old version of OpenShift. The situation was not that clear, so that's why we would like to avoid to use event as much as possible.
Okay. So
Yeah.
I definitely appreciate more insight if you have time to devote to that before the next session. I think this is sort of an active area of investigation that we haven't really, even in Federation V1, there hasn't been a lot of investigation as to how to like give useful feedback to the user or give them visibility to the system. So any help is very much appreciated. Sorry, you're fun.
No, I was just saying, thank you, I moderated that. I was saying that we probably need to continue discussion around this and might not be solved like pretty soon, or we might not have a clear solution very soon. But we basically need an active discussion around this.
Yeah, we're also at time for now, so we should wrap this up.
Yeah, so there was one more point. I think we can reserve that for next meeting, maybe 5-10 minutes in the next meeting. Okay, that was around upgrades where we probably will see API upgrades. For example, we'll start with V1 Alpha 1 for the federated resource, and then we'll move to something new. And we probably might also think about how exactly will we chart our path for that. The other is release upgrades, where a user might have an active FCP, control plane running, and they just want to, after a couple of months or whatever, when a new version comes in, they want to upgrade to a new version, which might have different, which might support different KHS API versions. So that is something which probably we should discuss, but maybe in the next meeting.
Yeah, I think there's prior art in Kubernetes that we can rely upon, but yeah, that's definitely something we should nail down.
Yeah. Okay, guys. Thanks for your time. See you on Monday.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Bye, thanks. Bye.
See you, everybody.